Now it's time to move on to the next step, which will be the headers. These headers came with the motor when I bought it. I think they're for like a 06 Charger or 300 SRT. They're just like a $200 set of eBay headers, so they're not going to fit the car, but I can use them, you know, cut them up and use the flanges and the collectors to make something that'll fit. So the first thing I need to do is get the collectors and flanges cut off, and then I can, you know, bolt them on and go from there. Alright, so you can see in here how this was put together. You just kind of slide the pipes in the collector and then weld it all the way around, but before you do that you have to kind of seal all this in here up so it doesn't leak. So now I can go ahead and cut all this out and clean up this collector so that we can reuse it, and also I'll cut all this off, and that way we can weld our V-band on. Alright, now I got a good clean collector to work with, and now it's time to cut the tubes off the flange. Alright, so I got everything all chopped up, cleaned up. The flange is ready to accept new tubes, as is the collector. So I'm going to start dissecting the other one, but I want to do something a little different on it. I'm going to make my cut here where the tubes come into the collector. I'm going to make it a little closer to this end of the collector. That way all the like that little filler panel in between the tubes and all that should just come out, and then it'll stay on the tubes. I can cut it up from there and it'll make things a lot faster. Okay, so let's talk about designing headers. This is my first time designing and building headers, so I decided to do the hard side first just to go ahead and get it out of the way. And there's a lot of things going on the passenger side of the motor. Of course, the starter comes in this location. There's a knock sensor, the engine mounts. Also, you have to worry about where the bolts actually bolt the flange to the heads. To make things even more difficult, I've decided to try to make it as equal length as possible, just to kind of eke out just a few more horsepower, and the main thing is I like the way equal length headers sound. So I've already been designing on this side, and this is pretty close to where everything is going to be. Luckily I had an extra motor to lay up here and build off of, and I had an extra bell housing too, and I got my starter here. The header's kind of fallen down since last night, but I should be able to squeak the starter in here without any problems once they're finally built. So you have to think of the car as a whole package. So if I had these headers built and wrapped around the starter, and then the starter goes out and I have to take the whole car apart just to change the starter, that's not good. Luckily I don't have to worry about spark plugs on this motor since they come through the top. That's a good thing about Hemis and dual overhead cam engines, is the spark plugs aren't in the way. If I had like an LS or any other pushrod V8 with the spark plugs coming in here, it would be really hard to design these headers and have access to the spark plugs. So when I was doing my research on how to design these headers, I came across a few articles and forum posts and things that said for the best scavenging, you want your firing order to be in succession in the collector. So instead of just firing at random intervals, you kind of want it in a circular motion. So like on this, it's 184-36572 is the firing order, or just for the passenger side, it's 8462. So you have 8 here, 4, 6, 2. So it's going in a circular pattern, and I'm going to do the same on the other side, and since I'm running an X pipe, I'm going to do them in opposite. Whether this does anything or not, I have no clue, but it sounds good in theory, and I think it'll make the actual sound of the engine kind of cool. So in order to build these sort of mock-up headers, I used a few different techniques. There are some kits that are kind of like Legos for headers that you can put together and design it like this, but those kits are like, you know, $500–600. So I'm using 1¼ inch conduit, and I'm using these conduit 90s that have a long sweeping curve, and it just happens to match this material that I already had. This is a swimming pool ladder handrail. I have a bunch of these, and it matches the radius pretty good. The other techniques I've used, I had some of this corrugated 1 3/4 like tubing here. This is like, I think it was an old vacuum hose or something, and I used a 1/8 inch welding rod, bent it whatever I needed, then kind of taped it up. And that's sort of crude and rudimentary, but it kind of gives you some rough bends if you need to, put it up in the chassis, look around, see what you're dealing with. So I used a few of these, but I found that the best thing instead of that is to use pie cuts. And so I grabbed some of that 1 1/4 conduit, cut it at a bunch of 5-degree angles, and you can see if you cut it closer, like say you cut it at 2 5-degree angles, about like this, then it's going to have a longer radius. But if you cut them like these, really close together at the top, then it's going to have a tighter radius. So you can use that to your advantage. You could actually just buy straight stainless steel tubing or whatever you're building your headers out of, and cut a bunch of pie cuts and make headers out of just pie cuts. But the thing is, you have to have something that can cut them really accurately and cut a bunch of them, because doing stainless steel like on a bandsaw or a chop saw, a lot of times you're going to wear out your blades. So I'll probably, whenever I finish doing this, I'll probably will use some pie cuts, but I'm going to try to order as many bends as I can to make it work and use the material I already have. So that's the techniques I used to make this. Another thing I want to show you is when you go to order your bends, you need to know what radius they're going to be. That's why I made this little board here. I just took a piece of welding wire, put it on a screw, marked it every 2 inches, and just ran a Sharpie around, and that gives you your radius. When you're ordering your radius tube, you need to remember that normally when you're dealing with tube, the radius is going to be measured at the middle of the pipe. If you have a 7-inch radius, which is about what this is, 7, 8, 6, the radius is not measured on the inside or the outside, it's measured right through the middle. So that's it for this side. That's how I think I'm going to need it. I'm sure I'm going to have to do a lot of tweaking to make everything work the way I want it to once I start building it in metal. But before I do that, I need to design the other side, so I'm going to roll this motor over and start working on that. Hopefully it'll be easier than this side because I have a lot more room on the driver's side. Once I have the design on the other side roughed out, I can start ordering some bends and then making these things out of metal. Alright, so over the past few weeks I've worked on building the headers in my spare time, and I've finished the mock-up of the headers both sides, and then I started making them out of metal. Here's one tube I've been working on, and you can see its kind of plastic counterpart here, and then that's the tube I've put together. And I'm using these are 1 3/4 clamps, just normal hose clamps that I windowed out with a Dremel, so that way I can put the joints up together and then tighten this down, and it holds them pretty well. And then it has the windows where you can go in and tack them once you have them kind of exactly where you want them to be. So you can tell on these two how the radius here is a lot bigger than the radius that was in the plastic one. So I had to make a few adjustments on this tube to make all of this work. Alright, so I got the tubes for number 5 and number 7 mocked into place. And like I mentioned earlier, the radiuses, or radii, whatever you call them, that are here were too big compared to the mock-up tubes I made. So I couldn't get the mandrel bends as tight as I wanted them to be. So that's causing issues because I have to sneak 2 other tubes through here to get to the collector. So the plan was to kind of slide through here between the frame rail and the motor mount. I've already trimmed my motor mount some just to try to get this through here. And as you can tell, there's still about 1/8 of an inch to go. So if it's touching the cross member and the frame right here, and the motor's trying to, rock around and putting stress on this, you'll get stress fractures and cracks, things like that, which we do not want. So I'm gonna have to take these tubes out and reposition them, try to swing them up, maybe put a tighter radius on this one. I do have a tighter radius for this tube, but that means taking the tubes back out and pretty much reconfiguring the entire thing. Alright, so after reconfiguring a few things, I have all the tubes past the motor mount and past the steering shaft. So everything is sort of working out the way I want it to. You can tell it's a very, very tight fit. But even like right here where this tube passes between the motor mount and the frame rail, there's enough clearance. There's not a lot of clearance, but I don't think I'll have any contact, and if I do, I can start hammering things to make, you know, enough clearance. So what I have left on laying out the tubes and getting everything designed on this side is figuring out exactly where the collector is going to be. So I have one tube ran out here, and this is for the number 1 cylinder. Number 3 is coming down right here. This is going to get cut off at some point up here and kind of wrapped around and brought into here. You can see I pulled it up and then kicked it down, and that's just because on the collector I wanted that V-band there. I wanted it to be sort of the lowest part. I'm trying to protect the header as much as possible, and like I said, on the collector, the V-band is the lowest part, and that V-band can easily be replaced, and it's like a $10 part versus the $1,000 set of headers I'm building. So yep, run these last 3 tubes out and this side will be done. Then I'll have to order some more tubing because I have cut up and configured about everything that I have here, and then we'll get to building the other side. So here's the passenger side header so far. You can see number 2 is really simple. It just bends around. The frame rail is about right here, and we also have to miss the engine mount that's in this area. I have about an 1/8 inch clearance on both sides, and it goes on down. I'm probably going to cut the tubes and then kick them all down, but I'll wait till I get the other 2 tubes built before I start doing that. These are really close in length, so I'm happy with that. The original plastic tubes I made sort of came up and then went way over. This one I cut it across like that, and it saved some of the length and made it more equal length to this tube. So you can see it comes up and around so that there's access to that bolt, and also misses this tube. So both of these tubes are going to be kind of tough because I have to make them wrap around and then go on the inside of these 2 tubes, and the starter and the bell housing and all of that is in the way, so they're going to have to come above the starter and then kick down and come out and meet the collector where these will. So that's going to be the toughest part of probably this whole header build, is making these 2 tubes work out. Alright, so I'm having some issues here getting this last tube ran out. So I have 2, 6, and 8 ran down at least past the starter. I thought I could take number 4 around and go in between 8 and 6 and the frame rail, and then duck it around and go out where it needs to be. But there's just not enough room to get through right there. So it's hitting the frame rail and both tubes. Alright, so you can see that's number 6, and I put that extra length in there just to make it equal length, and that's not bothering anything, but where that gap of light is right there, that's where I want number 4 to come through, and there's just not enough room. So what I may end up having to do is just notch the frame rail right there just to make it have room enough to come through. So I could move 8 up, but 8 is already working out to be a little bit longer. I think I would rather keep them as close to equal length as possible and just notch that frame rail, because once I get that frame rail notched, it'll still be as strong, if not stronger, than it is now. Alright, so I've made a little progress on the headers over the last couple days during my spare time, and I want to show you what I've got so far. So I've had them in and out of the car a couple times, and I had to notch the frame rail, and it's real ugly right now, but whenever I take the engine out, then I'll clean all this up and fill it in, make it nice. But I had to chop out right here in the inner fender and then took a pretty good hunk out of it here on the frame rail. So I'm gonna beef that up a little bit and make sure it's nice and pretty. And with the header in there, you probably couldn't even tell it. So let's move on and actually look at the header. So there's the tube that we're working on, number 4. And you can see there's still access to that bolt hole, but I don't think with the frame rail being like right here, it'd probably be hard to get an extension and a socket in there, but there's plenty of room to get to it from the top. You just have to work around the valve cover. We will have to set the headers down in the car and then probably bring the transmission either up through the bottom or put it in first and then set the headers down and then drop the engine in. So it's not ideal, but as long as it's possible, that's all that matters. So we're packing such a big engine in this tiny little package, so you have to make some compromises to make it work. This is passing through the notch we just put, and I'm going to go ahead, finish this out, leave enough room to get this bolt out and pass it on down through here. What we might have to do when we're installing this header is go ahead and thread in at least a few of these on the bottom side, but they're all slotted, so we can just set the motor down, hang the header, tighten it all down, and then probably bolt it all to the transmission. Alright, so I got all my tubes in now. You can see I got them all lined up, exiting in a row here. So there's going to be a hump right here where this, so the collector will kind of be in this area, and there's going to be a hump in the floor to wrap around the collector, so passenger may have a bit of a hot foot, but it'll be okay. Probably what's going to happen is once I get that collector down and get everything to where I want it, we'll weld in the firewall how we want that, and then I'll have a removable transmission tunnel. That way we can unbolt it, get it out of the way, and get to the bell housing bolts much easier. Alright, so I got number 2 and 8 kicked down, and I have the collector about where I want it. Obviously those will have to be trimmed. That stick represents about where the floor is, so once this is up, you know, where it's supposed to be, the bottom of the floor should be about the top of the exit of the collector. So everything should work out about right, should be about the same as the driver's side. And so now I just have to make the other 2 tubes work out. They have to wrap around and then come down the sides and exit at the same spot as these. And once I get that done, weld everything up and we'll be good to go. Alright, so I got everything ran out. It's looking pretty good. When I get a chance, I'll put it in the car and make sure everything's exactly where it needs to be. But I'm pretty confident that this is going to be the final design, and these are pretty much ready to, you know, cut the excess off and weld them up. Okay, so I got the headers in the car, or all the tubes anyway. They're not welded up yet, and it was like a puzzle. It's really hard. You have to like snake them all in, and they only go in like one certain way. You have to put 2 tubes in at one time and then snake the others through. But I finally got them in. There they are. You can see passenger floor well is going to be a little smaller because of these, but that's the only way I could have fit them in there and still been able to get the starter out from the bottom. They're angling down now, and so the collector will come past and then go, the exhaust pipe will come through and go under the transmission cross member that's about right there, just like this side where those are angled down. And I'm really happy with how these things turned out. I can't wait to weld them up and actually install them in the car. One of the coolest things to me is that these are pretty much full long tubes. They're a little shorter than most long tubes, but you can't even see them. I know the collector's not welded on there, so the collector will hang down a little bit, but you have to go way down here to even start seeing the pipes. So once the collector is on it and the exhaust is hanging down and, you know, going down and then flattening out, it's going to hang down a little bit, but like I mentioned earlier, I would much rather the exhaust be hanging down than these headers that I just spent a lot of time and money building. Even though I built them out of a scrap tube and old eBay headers that were used, they're still, I have like probably about $500 worth of tubing in it. I bought about $700 worth of tubing. If you're going to do this, plan on buying $700 or $800 worth of tubing and just expect to have some left over. But in order to get the job done, that's just kind of what you're going to have to expect. If you're doing stainless, of course, mild steel is going to be a lot cheaper. So if you're thinking that those nice stainless headers that are $1,000 are overpriced, you might want to rethink that, because building them yourself, if you have a application that somebody already makes headers for, a lot of times it's going to be way better unless you're doing something custom, like moving the engine around or dropping a Hemi into a Conquest. But for now, I'm just really happy with the progress I made and really happy it's over with. So pretty much the hard part's done. Or I probably just jinxed myself, but I'm just going to weld everything up, make sure they're exactly where I want them to be, tack them to the flanges, and then weld the collectors on. Okay, so it's almost time to start welding up my header primaries, but before I do that, I wanted to first of all practice a bit, because I haven't done a lot of stainless welding or welding tubes, much less doing them both together. Fortunately, stainless is not very much different from mild steel. The only thing is you tend to have a little more distortion, but when you're welding on tubing, your distortion is going to be kind of at a minimum, especially on this thicker tubing that I'm using. A few other little things, one of which is sugaring, which is what happens on the back side of the weld. So if you're getting full penetration, you're going to have sort of like this crystallized looking metal on the back side of the weld. And that's why when you're doing tubing like this, you need to back purge when you're welding on stainless. And this is the first time I've ever back purged, and so I wanted to practice doing that also, as well as practice, getting my rhythm down. So what back purging is, it's just filling the tube with argon, which is the same gas that you're using when you're TIG welding, that's spraying around the tungsten, and it's going out and kind of forming a barrier between the atmospheric air and the weld. So you want to do that on the inside of the tube as well, and that's why you fill it with argon. And there are all kinds of fancy ways to do it. Since I'm cheap and broke, I'm just using 2 rags. I got 2 bottles of argon. I took the regulator off my MIG welder and hooked it to 1 bottle. And I'm just running the open hose off of my MIG welder. All I'm doing is just shoving a rag into one end to block it off. And obviously some gas will run out of the rag, but that's good. That keeps a fresh supply of gas. And then I'll just wrap the rag around the other hose here and shove it in. Once I have it in there and sealed, I'll turn on my bottle. I'm not turning it on all the way just because I don't want to waste a bunch of argon. Then once I have my bottle open, I've been cranking it up to about 20 to 15 CFH, and then bringing it back down to around 7 to 10 CFH. Once you get it full and all the air purged out of it, and then you can back down your argon just so that you're not wasting a whole bunch, which I'm doing now. I've been keeping it going at about 7 to 10 CFH while I'm welding, and that just shields the back side of the weld and keeps it from sugaring on the inside. So I'm going to show you the difference here. So this is the one I did without back purging, and you can see it's real ugly on the inside of there. And I think I had better penetration on this one. I don't know if it's just keeping it cooler whenever I'm back purging it or what. So on these two, they were back purged, and one of them I had the amperage a little higher, so I had a little better penetration. I still need to get a little more penetration for my liking, but you can see the difference between these welds, where the back side is nice and smooth and looks just like the front side, and these are nasty, and you can tell that they kind of stick out and are making the airflow more turbulent and sort of necking down the pipe a little more, and that causes a restriction. Not only does this help flow, but it also helps like moisture and everything from getting into the joint of the weld whereas this will kind of retain the moisture and it'll get caught in all those little crystallized places. So back purging is definitely a good idea when you're doing stainless tubing. I want to get a little more penetration, but it's looking pretty good, especially since I haven't even TIG welded very much lately. So I think it's time to pull all the tubes out of the car and actually start welding them up. So kind of exciting. Alright, so here's the passenger side tubes all welded up. You can see with this one that the back purge worked good, getting good penetration all the way around. I'm happy with them. So pretty late now, and we'll pick back up with the other side tomorrow. Alright, there they all are, all welded up and ready to be put back into the car. And then we will tack them to the flanges, pull everything back out, which probably includes the motor too at that point. And then we'll have to weld around the tubes, weld it all the way fully to the flange, and then put the collector on, and we'll be done. Easy as that. Alright, so I got the tubes tacked to the flanges, and I went ahead and pulled the motor and pulled them out. It was really tough getting into there with the TIG torch and, you know, filler and doing the pedal and all while you're on your back and all that. So it was really hard to get the torch in position and get a good tack, but I was able to get a couple good tacks on most of the tubes and at least one good tack on every tube. So I did make this piece here, which is just a piece of channel, and I drilled holes for both flanges that I can bolt it to here. This keeps it pretty solid and keeps it flat, so I can, you know, move it around and weld it where I need it to be and not be trying to teeter the thing or clamp it down anywhere. So this is going to keep everything nice and flat where I can get to it, and it will keep the flange flat because we're going to be putting some heat into this flange. I don't want it to warp. So I'm going to weld up whatever's touching the flange now, and then I'll take them in there, clean up if there's any ugly tacks, clean them off, and then I will make it all fit good, because around the flanges it just isn't touching in some places, so I'm going to have to somehow expand that tube a little bit to touch the edge so that I can weld it up, because obviously doing TIG welding you want a really nice fitment. Alright, so I'm working on getting the flanges all welded up to the tubes, and you can see there's a little gap between the tubes and the flanges. They were just a little bit too big for 1 3/4 tube, even though that's what they had in them. Whenever they had the tubes mounted, they were kind of kicked at an angle, and that closed up the gap. But a lot of mine aren't at an angle. I tried to kind of come out and then start making my bends just to make it flow a little better. I was able to take a punch and just kind of hammer on them and massage that tube, and you can see it closed up the gap pretty well. Pretty much every tube needed some sort of massaging, and you can see it still had a little bit of a gap, but it welded up just fine. So and that's even using 1/16 inch filler wire. There is a lot of like tight places that it's hard to get into, especially since I'm using a pretty large cup with a gas lens just to try to smooth out the argon. But I may have to switch to a 1/16 inch tungsten and a small cup to try to get into the small places. We'll get this one finished up and start on this one. Then we can get the collectors fitted, and these things will be done. Alright, so while I was waiting on my flange to cool down before I unbolted it from my flat piece of metal here, I went ahead and measured all the tubes because I want to figure out exactly where to cut the excess tube off of these to put the collector. So I believe the best thing to do in order to get both banks as equal as possible is I'll cut this one flush with this 29, and then I'll cut this one an extra 1/2 inch on every tube, bring these down to 30, and of course this one will be 29.5 and then 30.25. So that means both sides will be an average of 30 inches, and the biggest difference of course will be on here from 30.5 to 29, and this one will be 30.25 to 29.5. So, you know, 1.5 difference here, 3/4 difference here. So that's pretty close considering the really tight tolerances we're dealing with in this engine bay. So I'm really happy with that, and I think the way I've got the collector laid out in a circular pattern and both banks averaging out to the same basic length, I think it's going to sound really cool, especially when you get it up in higher RPM. Alright, so I got the headers mocked up on the motor out here on the engine hoist, and they look amazing to me. I can't get over how these things turned out. I'm really happy with them. Right now I just have the tubes kind of fused together just so they don't move around. I still have to get the collectors on. This one's just sitting here. But I've been kind of looking, and I even put obviously the bell housing and the starter on just to make sure everything's fitting properly. Getting to that bolt is going to be a pain, but at least you can swap out the starter without taking anything else apart. So that was a priority of mine, and I'm glad that we can get that done. Another thing that I'm excited for that I really didn't expect, I put an O2 sensor in the bung here, and it misses the transmission. So I wasn't expecting that to happen. I thought I was going to have to plug the O2 sensors bungs that are on the collectors and put another one somewhere else. But it looks like we'll be able to use this one and read off of it. So the next step will be getting the collectors on, and then we'll be done. But before we get the collectors on, we still have to plug this hole in the middle and also the holes on the edges. But for this hole in the middle, I made some little spikes. So here are my little spikes I made that will go in that hole, something like that, and get welded on. The original headers that I cut apart had just a flat plate in there to plug that hole, and that works, but I'm thinking as the air comes out of each pipe, it's going to cause like a low pressure area right here, which you want low pressure to scavenge the pipes out, but I'm thinking it will cause a lot of disturbance and hurt more than it'll help. So this is sort of more like a merge collector, and it just will sort of make the air smooth out and flow better as it goes through the collector. So we'll have to weld these in and do the collectors, put them on, and weld them up. I think before I put the collectors on too, I'm going to weld the V-band on, but then the headers will be done. Alright, so here's one of the spikes I got welded on, and I still have to weld on the other one, and I did the collectors, got the V-bands welded on them. So once I weld on that other one, then I have to figure out what I want to do between here and the collector where the pipes kind of come together on the outside. On the original headers that I cut up, it was just filled in with weld, and I think that's probably what I'm going to do too. Just make it a lot easier and quicker to do that instead of trying to make something. This isn't a true merge collector. I was trying to save a little bit of money and just use the collector that came off the eBay headers. So if I had to do it over again, I might would have bought merge collectors just to make these, you know, really nice. But I think just filling that edge in with weld, and it'll be good enough. Alright, so I want to show you how I welded up the tubes to fill up the gap between the tubes and the collector. So make sure you can't just weld like right here. You have to weld all the way up the tube, or else air will pass through right there. So have to weld the tubes together, start at the corner, and make the turn come all the way around. So I didn't back purge this, so it sort of went through in a few places, so I just cleaned that up with a die grinder, and now it's ready to receive the collector. So now we should be able to just weld all the way around the collector, and it should be sealed up all the way from the port to the exhaust, and I shouldn't have any exhaust leaks, which is what we're going for. Alright, there is the passenger side header. It's all welded up. I wanted to show you how I back purged it, and I just got the rag shoved in the end and then bolted it to my thing here, and that's keeping the argon from running out that side. The hose here is just going right into where the O2 sensor bung is, and since I had a bung on both collectors, I was able to back purge both of them, and it worked out pretty good. So collectors, everything's welded up. They're pretty much done. I want to clean up a little bit on the inside of the flange, then we'll get them on the motor, and that'll be it. Alright, so there's one more thing I wanted to do before I finished up these headers, and that was come back on the inside and just fuse this together where the tube stuck through the flange. So I'm not using hardly any filler. I did use a little bit just to get it started, but I'm just making little pulses just to close up where the tube is coming through there. That way it doesn't catch any moisture or air or anything in that, and it'll just seal it up nice and make it nice and smooth. And then also you can see where I had the penetration coming through where I welded it on the flange. I'll probably just clean that up with a die grinder just because it bothers me. I have a piece of aluminum that's nice and flat, and I'm going to run it on here with some sandpaper just to make sure all of that is nice and flat, and we'll seal off, and then the headers will be ready to rock. So finally the headers are done, and I'm super excited with how these things turned out. I think they're going to be like the best feature of the whole car, at least in my opinion, even though you can only see like 20% of them once they're in the car. But they just look so cool to me, the way they lay over the frame rails and kind of snake through the car. And I'm thinking this equal length setup, along with the mufflers and everything I'm wanting to run, it's going to sound pretty wicked. So that's it for this video. I've got to finish up a few things on the car, and then we'll start working on getting like radiator, probably cage. I want to seam weld the whole chassis. So, but all of that will be coming up in part 4 and probably part 5 and 6 and 8 and 10. But until then, you can check us out on social media. We are at Racing Rejects on Instagram and Facebook. If you want to email us for any reason, it's theracerejects@gmail.com. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. See you guys later.